My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am here with Clint Guadiana, and I this year had the opportunity to go on a fascinating trip to a part of the world that I'd never been to, a part of the United States I'd never been to. And this was down in extreme southern Texas. And for me, having never been there, it was just really an amazing place in that I didn't even realize there were habitats and ecosystems like this in Texas. It almost felt, somewhat like I was in southern Florida. Just it was subtropical. The plants were much different than a lot of Texas. The rainfall, the reptile and amphibian communities, just a fascinating place. And I was lucky to meet Clint there, and one of the things that fascinated me so much about him and the time we spent together was that he is the curator of herpetology at the zoo in Brownsville. But at the same time, he's a field herper and somebody, not a casual field herper that goes out, there are a number of people that do that, but a really dedicated field herper. And I just really got the sense that, he was one of the field herping authorities, if you will, in this region. So had a great trip, got to experience both aspects of, Clint's life and work in the herpetology space. So I thought it would be great to get him on the podcast and kind of share those two sides of things and just learn a little more about that region and some of the species there. So welcome to the podcast, Clint. I'm happy to have you.
Hey, thanks, Chris.
Well, I like to start my episodes by just kind of getting a better understanding, giving the audience a better understanding of, who our guest is and how they ended up getting where they are today. So first of all, did I get it right? Your title is technically the Curator of Herpetology?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, Curator of Herpetology at the Gladys Porter Zoo in Brownsville. And I've been at the zoo now for going on 14 years.
Yeah, that's great. And I will say, we're going to talk about the zoo later in this episode, but I was really impressed because, again, Brownsville is this town that's kind of out of the way for most of us that live here in the States. And I was really impressed with the zoo. And I can't stress that enough. And I'm really sincere in that. I mean, all around, from a herpetological perspective, but really everything. It was just, I definitely put it in one of the, the top end of my zoo list. And I've been to a lot of them. So you're the curator of herpetology there, and what I'm curious is how you ended up getting there, and we talked a little bit about this when we were together, and it's a story that's maybe a little different than some people end up in your position, and so I think it's a good story for people to hear. But I guess we'll start at the very beginning. So how was it that you ended up getting so into herpetology, snakes, frogs, lizards, all the variety of species that we all love, to the point where you've dedicated your career to it and you've dedicated a large part of your recreation to it as well? Did this happen as a child or as you got older in life?
So, yeah, I think that it's actually quite unconventional for most herpers or zoo people. Usually here people are kind of into this since they were kids, and and everything, or their parents took them out, hiking, fishing, camping, all that stuff. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, in the middle of the city, and my parents were not outdoorsy at all. So I had to make do with whatever I had around my house, which could be geckos, it could be scorpions, spiders, and that's kind of all I did was just go out and look for them. Nothing really told me to do that. I just did it. And then when I was going into my seventh grade year, we moved up into the mountains, and then I just went crazy. So I was almost a teenager at this point, and that's when I started really chasing snakes and trying to learn about them. Science fairs, I would always do something on reptiles, and then just try and be out in the field as much as possible. And then I moved back down to close to Phoenix, where I met a friend of mine named Kel Morris, and he really set me on the path of kind of the captive husbandry stuff. He worked for the Phoenix Herpetological Sanctuary, and I got to volunteer there and learn a lot of stuff about venomous snakes, which was always my favorite. Rattlesnakes especially are some of my favorites. And that experience I got there volunteering allowed me to apply for the position at Gladys Porter Zoo in 2010. And I was selected because they needed someone to do venomous. And so I had about 2.5 weeks to move halfway across the country to Brownsville, Texas. Like you said, not a lot of people know about it. I had to look it up. I had never heard of it. And when I found out it was on the border of Mexico, I was even more excited just because of the species that occur here. And a lot of the species down here occur nowhere else in the whole United States. They barely make it here in the southern tip of Texas.
Yeah, so it sounds like you had, what a lot of people who are into reptiles and amphibians have, meaning you had that interest as a child. You were just kind of stuck in an urban environment in a family that didn't go out of that urban environment too much. So you're almost like an urban herpetologist as a child. and then, so when you said you moved up to the mountains,
forced to be.
Yeah. When you say you moved up to the mountains, were those the mountains in Arizona or somewhere further north?
I didn't even bother saying the name of the town because most people would never have heard of it. It's a small copper mining town called Globe, Arizona. And it's about 75 miles to the east of Phoenix. And that's what I mean by the mountains. It's surrounded by just beautiful mountains and even high elevation mountains where you get things like Crotalus cerberus and Crotalus molossus. So you get the montane stuff, and then right in the city you have western diamondbacks and Mojave rattlesnakes. As well as Sonoran coral snakes and Gila monsters, all kinds of good stuff up there that I did not have in the middle of downtown Phoenix.
And so you said, we share this in common, but venomous snakes are both of one of our primary interests. And so were you? Well, let me back up. You said you got most of your venomous snake handling experience at the sanctuary that you worked at. But were you enamored with rattlesnakes when you were young? Were you handling them at a young age, or was that not something that happened until later?
I actually didn't find my first rattlesnake until I was almost 18 years old. For whatever reason, I didn't have a guide. I didn't really know how to field herp when I was in my teens. So when I moved back close to Phoenix, I was able to find my first rattlesnake, which was a Mojave rattlesnake. And then I was obsessed after that. Every time I could, I'd go back to that spot or somewhere near there and just kept finding rattlesnake after rattlesnake. And that really unlocked that passion for herping, but rattlesnakes in general. And I was very lucky enough to meet the fellow I mentioned, Kale, who allowed me to work at that sanctuary as well. And then there I got to do all kinds of exotic venomous stuff. We had gaboon vipers, we had cobras, we had just a lot of variety of neat stuff there, as well as crocodilians and non-venomous as well. And then it allowed me to also do some outreach stuff because we'd go to different schools and parks and things like that and try to reach younger audiences and just educate people as much as we could about reptiles. So all that kind of built my resume in order to be able to join the zoo team all those years ago.
Yeah, and so in those formative years, once you'd moved up into the mountains outside of Phoenix, uh, would you say that, you said you were, out looking for rattlesnakes and everything really, but so would you say that, at that point in your life, even before you started the captive husbandry work, that, that you were a field herper at that point and pretty dedicated to it, or was it still a casual thing at that point?
Once I found that first rattlesnake, it was dedication, not casual anymore. I spent all the time I could trying to find those, but everything. I mean, I was in the land of reptiles. I was very fortunate, and so anything I could find, I was after. And then it got me into photography and things like that. That followed. That follows the hobby generally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so just for the audience sake, when I was saying, maybe a slightly non-typical trajectory to being a curator of herpetology, um, first of all, it seems like it was a relatively fast, um, movement into that position, but it's kind of a different trajectory, having that interest and that love, working at one facility and then moving to the zoo where you're currently living. So to compare and contrast that for the audience, we've had a couple curators on, but just curious if you could kind of line out what would be a more typical trajectory for somebody who ends up in a similar position to yours. Not so much in terms of their upbringing, that's going to vary, but I mean in terms of the paths you may go through in your career typically to become a curator of herpetology.
Well, I guess I left out a little bit. I moved down here and I was not curator right away. That also took quite a bit of time. I started out as just a keeper and then supervisor and then moved up from there. So in that sense, it is pretty typical. Usually people start as zookeepers and, they develop as leaders and they move to supervisor or manager or whatever it may be. But a lot of times I talk to a lot of people in the zoo field and they're on their fourth or fifth zoo. A lot of times you have to move around the country to move up as curator. And I was lucky enough to be developed here in-house and being able to move up the ranks. But I guess by not so typical, my upbringing was just because I was sheltered for most of my life as a child of this stuff. And then I just volunteered for a year and a half in, a little sanctuary just doing venomous. I think most people volunteer at zoos and start as interns, and then they get those jobs at their hometown zoo. I didn't have any option to go to the Phoenix Zoo, which was my local zoo. And so I put my resume out there to several zoos. I was volunteering at the sanctuary, so I was like, well, I really enjoy this and I would love to make a career out of it. And so I did have to look at other zoos. I think I applied to about 4 or 5 of them and the only call I got was Gladys Porter Zoo. And luckily I got the position.
Yeah. That's a good point too, that the zoo field, I've never worked in I guess I did technically work for the Bronx Zoo, but I was working on field conservation nowhere near the zoo. But in that zoo field, I know a lot of people, and it's similar to some other fields that, where people may have an interest in snakes. If you're going to be, I don't know, more on kind of the trajectory I took, like wildlife biologist, and say you get in with the Forest Service or some other big entity like that. It's pretty typical, like in the zoo field, that, to advance throughout your career, you have to go where opportunity is, and it's pretty rare to be able to get to one place and be able to kind of stay there and build your career moving through the positions. Usually you're kind of bouncing around. So that's great, and you picked a pretty great place, both again from the zoo perspective as well as a field herping perspective to set down those roots. So, well, let's transition a little bit. I talked about one of the things that impressed me most about you was kind of this combination of being very dedicated to your work and the zoo and the conservation components, but also being a very dedicated field herper and, spending a lot of time out in nature looking for these animals and really kind of honing that craft. And I guess we'll kind of talk about these in the order that we spent them. So, we spent some time in the field, and then, the next day, I came in and visited the zoo, and you gave us a great tour. So why don't we start with the field herping, and I guess we'll kind of start at a higher level and just talk about the region in general. I don't feel like we're spot burning. We're not going to mention any particular locations or times of year or anything of that nature, but again, this extreme South Texas is widely known as a field herping destination, so we're not giving away anything. But why don't we talk about that, the region? And, I gave this description that it was, different than I imagined any environment in Texas. So maybe kind of just set that template for us, or that, background, if you will. Like, what is it? Not even necessarily herpetologically yet, but I mean, like, geologically, habitat-wise, climate-wise, what is it that makes that little corner of Texas so special?
So to me, it's a lot of different ecosystems meeting. So you have this subtropical zone that's, if you were down here in some of the habitat, you would think you were in tropical Mexico or even close to Central America. But then you can go an hour and a half to the west and you're almost getting into the desert. And then just intertwined with it is just beautiful water bodies. And there's these oxbow lakes that we call resacas down here, which are essentially tributaries from the Rio Grande River. And that harbors just a lot of migratory birds. So people come from all over the world to see those. But also, they come for a select number of species down here, which I call them the big five. So a lot of herpers come down to South Texas for speckled racers, indigo snakes, Mexican milk snakes, black striped snake, and cat-eyed snake. Those are kind of the big five that everyone's after down here. Again, if you could tell, all five of those species, they make it all the way almost to Panama, at least the species, not subspecies. But like speckled racers, cat-eyed snakes, black striped snakes, they make it all the way to the very tip of Central America. So that's one of the driving forces of what keeps me going too, is trying to unlock the secrets of these guys. Even though I found all these species, we can always learn more, which is kind of the origin of me setting tin stacks. Maybe you want to talk about some tin stacking. What do you think?
Yeah, I do, but I want to hit on a couple more broad topics first, because yes, I want to get into these tin stacks because, again,
Okay.
Being out in the field with you, I had the feeling that you had, you've come as close to mastering this as somebody can in that region, and I'm sure even those techniques would do well in other regions as well. So I definitely want to talk about that, but I want to stay broad for a couple minutes. So we talked about the region, being widely known as a field herping destination. You talked about some of these species, the big five, I think you called them, that kind of are at the northern edge of their range, and for some of them, it being the only place you can really go find them in the U.S. So I'm assuming you get a good number of field herpers that come to the region. I mean, do you have any, I guess, first of all, thoughts on the intensity of field herping there? Maybe some of the benefits, whether they just be kind of like awareness. If, this very species-driven approach where they're coming there to find certain things, does that have certain implications for the animals or the environments? Is there, any negative impacts of such a focused field herping effort? Just kind of anything you could elucidate around that.
Sure. So as far as it being such a targeted zone, there are certain times a year that this place just gets blitzed with field herpers. nowhere on the scale of something like West Texas or Arizona, but it's getting worse and worse every year. And I don't mean worse. It's good people come down here and want to enjoy these animals. I mean, they're fantastic, and I'm the same. I go all over different zones to find certain species, so I'm no different. The only thing negative impact is just some sites. We're all guilty of this. We find a nice spot when we're visiting somewhere, and then we find something cool. We post a photo of it instantly on any social media, and then you get bombarded with people, buddies asking, "Hey, where'd you find that?" or "When?" And then if you give that spot to someone, they may give that spot to 3 or 4 other people, and then it's open season on that one spot, which sometimes could just be one tin stack, it could be a board, it could be whatever it may be. And then that gets just overflipped or just visited too often and the habitat gets destroyed. And then maybe one person doesn't put that cover back correctly, and then the snakes don't use it anymore. And that's the negative impact of having so many herpers in a very short amount of time. And that's why it's important to, I always try when I visit places and I find a cool species, I don't post it right away. I don't post it in the field. I try to do it in the off season. So like if you're in Arizona and you find a neat rattlesnake species, I wouldn't post that till the winter or something like that, just to help whatever I can do to kind of keep that region from getting just so trampled.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, do you have any recommendations for field herpers that come down that could, just, good kind of ethical decisions they can make? I mean, you just mentioned one. Think about how you post and maybe, keep some of the detailed information to yourself. Any other kind of ethical, kind of recommendations that you might give field herpers that come down to the region?
Just to follow the laws, especially with some of the parks down here. There's some very well visited parks to find certain species. Most of those are hands off, and for good reason. Again, this is their only range in the whole United States, and you don't want to mess that up. And then also just, I'm sorry, I keep going back to this, but just putting cover back is some of the most ethical things you can do. It's very simple. It takes hardly any time. It takes less time to put it back than it did to actually flip it. And so that goes a long way to maintaining the sites for future use and also the overall health of those animals.
Reptiles face many challenges, from habitat loss to climate change. As an example, turtles are the most threatened group of animals on the planet, with over 60% of species classified as endangered. The Oriane Society is working hard to secure a thriving future for these incredible animals. To engage in the critical work we're doing, explore our website at www.oriane.org. There you'll find in-depth insights into the science, conservation action, and communication initiatives we're undertaking. Visit us today. And, I've gone field herping in West Texas many times now, and, it always struck me that, Texas, probably more so than most states, really has... they have regulations around field herping, maybe more akin to like fishing in some states. And so what are some of the, for example, we need a license, we need, talking about West Texas now, we need to wear kind of orange reflective vests when we're out at night and these types of things. I mean, is it the same laws that apply in South Texas, or how is kind of field herping regulated down there? What are some of the things that are legal, not legal, required, not required, those types of things?
So those laws that you talked about, like the vest and everything, that is statewide. So that's not just West Texas. That's not just the region. I think why it gets talked about so much in West Texas is because those game wardens there know that what field herpers are and what they're doing, and they have an eye to make sure that you have that vest, that you're not hunting from the roadway, things like that. But technically it's statewide. So in South Texas, North Texas, East Texas, it's the same thing. You're supposed to, if you're road cruising, you wear that vest. You're not supposed to move a snake or anything like that from the blacktop, from the asphalt roadway, which, I mean, I don't really agree with. I think if you're trying to save that animal's life, more power to you. But the laws are you're not supposed to move any kind of animal from the roadway unless you have a special permit. And so that's the same thing down here in South Texas. The game wardens down here are catching on to the people coming down here and looking for snakes. And like I said, especially at the parks. So yeah, same rules apply. Got to wear that vest. I know it's kind of annoying and gets hot and looks silly, but you got to do it.
Mm-hmm. So would it be, with this law about getting, obviously, say if you find any snake, but maybe a relatively rare snake on the blacktop, and you're afraid it's going to get killed. Is it, as long as you don't touch it, is it technically legal to get it off the road? Meaning, say you're behind it with a snake stick or just tapping the road and it physically moves off on its own. Is that technically illegal, or is that still illegal?
It's technically illegal if you are. I mean, I think whatever, but it's technically you are altering its behavior on the roadway, so or in its natural environment, which happens to be a road at that point. But as long, I think the gray areas, it's kind of like as long as you're not in front of that animal and changing its trajectory or anything like that, you're good to go. But yeah, technically you're not even supposed to get out of your vehicle and be on the roadway or anything like that, because it's considered hunting from the roadway. And so from my understanding, and I am not an expert on these laws, this is how I interpret them. If that animal was to get onto the right of way, which is public land, then you can manipulate with a hunting license and then the reptile stamp that you get added on to that hunting license. And so if you're out of state, you got to get the out of state hunting license and then get that reptile stamp, which I think is like $15 added on or something like that. And so that's fair game. Now, that does not include any of the protected threatened species that occur in the state or in South Texas, which we have quite a few, which I think 3 out of those big 5 I mentioned are threatened species. So it don't matter what kind of hunting license or anything, they're supposed to be hands off. And that includes for trying to pose them for photographs or anything like that. So yeah, that's kind of the rules down here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's transition a little bit and talk about these tin sets that we've been teasing. And normally, I would start from the very beginning on anything like this, and I would ask you kind of how you figure out where to put the tin sets, and are you using remote technology, or are you using boots on the ground? But I'm thinking probably best if we steer clear of that, unless you want to go into it. But so I guess where I'll start is I'm assuming you've used tin before moving to Texas, but you get down to Texas, you start field herping, and you realizing that flipping is an effective way for finding some of these species. And where did you start, and where did you end up in terms of your technique of actually placing tin?
Yeah, so actually, I had never even knew that tin flipping was a thing before I moved to Texas. In Arizona, nobody sets tin, or most people don't. I've heard most people in Arizona say that it's too hot for setting tin there. And so it wasn't until I got here, which I struggled quite a bit in the beginning with field herping down here, because it was so different than Arizona. And I found that I had to travel quite a distance away to get to the kind of better areas for looking for snakes, whereas in Arizona, I basically had really neat species 15 minutes down the road. So it took me quite a few years. I really didn't unlock things until maybe 2014 or 15, and now that's 4 or 5 years into living down here. And that was mostly road cruising and finally figuring out the weather of when it was good to road cruise and hike and things like that. And then the tin flipping and setting journey kind of really started from my friend Kyle Elmore, who has he has an awesome page and channel on YouTube called Pop Milk, and he's just the flip master. And so he gave me some good advice, and he's like, yeah, you're in South Texas. Flipping's awesome there if you can really unlock it. And so I started just procuring these sheets of tin however I could. Sometimes they were throwing some scrap pieces away at the zoo, so I started getting them. And then, I made the mistake of trying to set out, a single layer or a board here or there, which boards work down here too, but not as good as tin stacks. It wasn't really until I figured out that I had to stack those tin up to really maximize my chances of finding stuff. And it goes back to the climate, and it gets very hot down here as well. So you can't lay a single sheet of tin. It's just too hot. As soon as that sun hits it, it's going to just roast anything that's under it, and nothing will live under it. So by stacking these things, you really cause a thermal gradient in the different layers that they actually pick and choose from. So if something it was a cold night, they're going to move up to the top shelf to get that sun as it first hits it and warm up. As they get a little too hot, they go a couple stories down where it's a little cooler. And also as you kind of go down or in the middle, that's a lot of times where the moisture is as well. And I've kind of developed the technique to even maximize holding those temperatures and the moisture a little better, which is kind of hard to just describe without showing pictures. But it's essentially you're offsetting the sheets of tin down the middle about a foot off of each other, so that it's not just a solid stack that's just a perfect square. You're actually offsetting them quite a bit. So much so that I think you saw some of these stacks that you have to kind of open them one side and the other instead of just flipping all in one direction. And it makes it a pain in the butt to flip them. More hands, the better for that flipping, but it really seems to make a difference with locking in those temps and moisture and blocking outside light and wind from coming in is important. Especially when you're talking about sensitive things like milk snakes and things like that, they really want to stay in the dark and be as moist as possible. And so by blocking some of that wind and things like that with how you set these stacks, it pays off in the end. And so it took me a long time to realize all this. Like, this was a journey 10 plus years easily.
Yeah, and to me it was really ingenious, and to maybe give the audience kind of an analogy so they could really picture it. Like, if you imagined having whatever it might be, let's just say a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper, and you lay the first one down, instead of putting the second one right on top of it, let's just say you move it halfway to the left, so kind of half of the two pieces of paper are overlapping, and then on the edges you just have the two, and then you take a third piece and you overlap it essentially where the bottom piece is, and then your fourth piece overlaps the same footprint of the second one, and you build up in that regard. And I thought it was really ingenious. And there's just I didn't mention this when we were in the field, like, yeah, you could tell having multiple people certainly helped with flipping it, because you've got to hold them. You got to hold one side in one direction while you're pulling and holding another side of tin into the air. But the part that I actually thought was kind of tedious was not the flipping it, but it was the putting it back. And say we found a snake and we're all excited, or even if we didn't, like, remembering, you just can't set all this tin down at once, you now need to set one piece down. You set the second piece down, then you set the third piece. It was interesting, but I could see the. Go ahead.
Well, and to add to that, I didn't really put you guys through the ringer with this, but normally what I do also is each time I put, one layer down, I throw a handful of dirt or organic debris in between each layer just to kind of refill that, because that stuff is important for those animals as well. And kind of, so I went back to some of those sets later on, and I did all that the next time I flipped them, but that's also very important for keeping snakes in there and keep coming back. To
Yeah, I
those
bet
same
it probably
sites.
holds moisture, does all those things. The other thing that struck me, I've laid out a number of tin sets. I mean, this isn't something I do a lot, but I have laid some out, and we certainly have laid out stacks, but not, using that design. And, you talked about animals kind of moving up through the layers. What also really struck me is that, and I don't know if this is the case or if you think this is the case, but, these animals can kind of move up and down through this complex, gradient of heat and moisture without coming out from the stack. Like they can move into the middle and kind of snake their way, pun intended, up through the, through the tin. Is that something you've observed, or at least anecdotally, think is one of the benefits?
Yeah, exactly. So right, if you had just laid them uniform, they would have to come out to the edge and expose themselves to go up to the next layer, which also opens up to things like predators and anything else. So that offsetting allows them to basically, just snake their way up through the center of it without having to come out. And I haven't observed it personally because I'm not watching them, but I have flipped sets and then seen the same exact snake in the top when the temperature was a little cooler, and then went back and flipped it, and they're at the bottom when it's scorching hot. And so I know they're doing it. And I also have I've done it with a couple pet snakes where I've made them their own little tin stacks in their terrariums, and they do the exact same thing when I put the heat lamp on top of them. It's really neat.
Yeah, that's cool. So do you know of, well, first of all, before I go there, we talked about this technique of laying them offset. How many layers do you have, like what you think of as like an optimal number? I mean, is there for example, every time you lay down a piece of tin, it's a piece of tin that you need to acquire. It's energy to get that and get it there and flip it and put it back. Is there like an optimum number where, like a minimum where you feel like, well, if you have at least 5, it's giving them a good gradient, but if you have 8, it's getting overkill and they're not getting, the cost is more than the benefit?
It's funny you said those two numbers. So my perfect stack is 5 to 8 sheets.
Okay.
And that's, again, this is for South Texas, right? I don't know, other parts might not need this much or maybe need more, I don't know. But in South Texas, 5 to 8 is my favorite. Anything less, it just does not. You'll still find snakes in those kind of like 3 set things, no problem, but they'll usually be common stuff. And my observation is those are ones usually just transients that are just moving, and they seek shelter there maybe for the night or whatever. They're not actually using these things permanently. And so 5 to 8, we've been able to observe the same snakes come to and fro. And I've also finally been able to almost see the full cycle of my efforts pay off. And that's witness a Tamaulipan milk snake male show up in one of the sets we did. And then the next season, it was paired up with a female in the same tin stack. And then I came back later, and that female was gravid. And so I want to keep checking to see if she's going to lay the eggs there. Only time will tell. But the fact that they're coming back and utilizing, actually pairing up, and then the female is thermal regulating in the stack I created to help develop those eggs is just fantastic. And that was one of my end goals. I do these 10 setting, of course, for my own benefit, I enjoy setting them and flipping them and finding neat snakes. But also, I think it's important to set them for the animals themselves. Here in South Texas, we only have about 3% of native habitat left down here. And so with, ever developing, neighborhoods and human development just destroying these things' habitats, I think it's important to offer them what you can as far as a sanctuary goes so that they can keep living on there.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it like that. And certainly in other places, there are projects where, snake habitats being created, like pine snakes up in the Northeast and some other projects. So that makes a lot of sense. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but, even on the day we were out together, 2 of the snakes we found are snakes that you had found in those stacks previously, and you suspected they might be there. Again, more like you're creating habitat for these animals, more long-term habitat, say, than just kind of transient habitat as they move through the landscape. So
yeah, absolutely. We've seen this for a few years straight now, where these same snakes that we ID them to make sure they're the same ones. And they keep coming back and doing just natural things in these artificial habitats we've created.
Yeah. So last question on the 10, and then I do want to move into talking about some of your work, the zoo, and some of your work there. Well, I have one other question actually now that I think about it, but let's stay with the 10 first. But so do you know of other places in the country or in the world, as it may be, that people are using this technique that you and your friend there have been developing? And if so, do you know if it's been effective, or do you have any speculation as to whether it might be effective in other regions where tin flipping, like the Southeast where I live, for example, if using this type of approach would also be effective?
I think it would, especially you kind of just cater to where you're at for temperature wise and things like that. So I do think it's possible to set tin and flip snakes in Arizona, even though everyone says you can't. Even as hot as it gets, if you were to maybe stack those up, to 10 or more sheets, maybe half in the shade, half out, so that they can have some choices. I think it could pay off. And then Southeast, I mean, it's pretty similar climate to here. And I know that other people, and we don't claim that we've invented this offsetting technique. Other people may have already been using it. It's just something we noticed that it started working a lot better for us. And then we set all of our arrays like that now. I think 10 stacking can work anywhere around the world. I know there's some people that are setting sheets out in Australia and flipping red belly black snakes and different things over there. I'm sure it could work in Asia. It could probably work in the tropics, and maybe even the deserts. I think just by creating these nice habitats for them, somewhere for them to hide and shelter, I think is enough to draw the snakes in for sure.
Yeah. My last question before we get on to the zoo, and I guess part of this has to do with the zoo, so it's a good segue. This is snake talk. Obviously, we're mostly focused on snakes, but, I was out field herping with Noah at night, and you weren't with us at that time, but I found what I thought was just one of the coolest amphibians I've ever seen. And then the zoo, you showed me another one. Maybe just for a second, talk about those species. And I'm assuming you know the ones I'm talking about. I think the one we found in the field was a sheepfrog, I believe. Is that right? But anyways, just talk a little bit about those species. Yeah, and
if you're talking about the go ahead.
No, I believe it was called a sheepfrog was the common name. I cannot remember the Latin. And then the amazing frog you showed us in the zoo that lives in the region. So.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. So yeah, the sheepfrog Hypopaccus variolus. That's another rarity that only occurs down here in South Texas and then goes all the way through Central America. And so the one I showed you behind the scenes, well, sheepfrog, really cool species that like the sand sheet, the interior sand sheet of South Texas. They only come out when there's some good torrential downpours, which happened on one of the last nights you were here. And then the one I showed you behind the zoo is a very similar species, but even more rare and limited in range, and that's the Mexican burrowing toad, Rhinophrynus dorsalis. Yeah, and they're just an incredible species that they are basically in 2 counties in the whole United States. And those guys are very hard to find because you almost have to have hurricane-like flooding to draw them out for breeding. And so we have one at the zoo. We're hoping to get a nice breeding group going with those guys. And hopefully eventual goal is to breed them and do some releases in some of their more fractured habitat to try to repopulate that area for them.
Yeah. So it's not just the snakes, as you would all imagine. It's much broader than that. The amphibian diversity there is very unique, and I'm sure, I know from like a mammal perspective, a bird perspective, it's just a very unique region. So glad to be there. But let's transition and talk about the zoo. And I kind of started off and kind of gave a lot of superlatives. Basically like it really surprised me, this zoo in Brownsville, but it was very impressive. So maybe just kind of start at that highest level, and how would you what are your superlatives for the zoo in Brownsville? Why do you think it's so special relative to other institutions around the country, and why should people come visit?
Well, I think that we are on par with any of those big zoos as far as collection goes. We may not have the bankroll that they do just because they have a lot more visitors than we do. And that's one of the reasons, is because we are so isolated down here in South Texas. And like I told you, there's only basically people come down here for 2 reasons, and that's South Padre Island and the beaches here, and then the zoo. And usually the zoo is a byproduct of people going to the beach. So, but what we have is just an amazing collection and group of staff that just absolutely love what they do and are experts in every field. And I've really worked hard. I've always kind of went at it like an underdog mentality, because we were such a small facility with small payroll, things like that I wanted a world-class collection. And I'm just talking about the herps at this moment, but I wanted to be just have as good a collection as any of those big zoos. And I think we've accomplished that. We have some just amazing diversity of species. And going back to I'm a snake guy by trade, but I had to force myself. I know that there's a lot of amazing amphibians, turtles, all kinds of stuff. And so we try to have a balanced collection in the herp department, where we have the neatest, rarest herpetofauna that we can get, and in turn show the public and educate them on them.
Yeah, it was really impressive when I walked in I don't know if you call it the herpetarium, but whatever you call it, I'll call it the herpetarium for now, the reptile house, whatever. But when you walk in, it's laid out really nice. You're kind of up on a second story, and down below you is a scene with a wetland with crocodilians. Those were American alligators you had in there, right? I'm trying to remember. And you had a alligator snapper in there as well, just really visible, just kind of like it was like the centerpiece of the building, which was really nice. And then animals kind of distributed all around it, and the collection again was really diverse. Your crocodilians, a lot of different crocodilian species, a lot of obviously snakes, and a lot of international representation, Komodo dragons, and then pretty good representation from your local fauna too. And I even noticed there are a handful of handful of animals from your native land in Arizona, and I'm sure you had something to do with that. But maybe talk just how would you classify the herp collection you have, and maybe talk a little bit about how it's changed over time, in your tenure at the zoo.
Yeah, I would say that we do focus on a lot of tropical species, mainly because of our climate. We are pretty fortunate, like you said, with the crocodilian collection, we can keep things outside pretty much year round. And so that's why we have so many outdoor crocodilians and tortoises and Komodos, things like that stay outside all the time. And that's one benefit of the subtropical climate of South Texas, being down here. And then as far as the Arizona stuff go, yeah, you got to sprinkle in some stuff from all over, and it's nice to see those on a daily basis. It reminds me of home.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of some other standouts. You have king cobra. One thing that I thought was really interesting, you mentioned the tortoises and a lot of the crocodilians as well. Like, there is the central, reptile house, but there's also, there are exhibits throughout the zoo with giant tortoises and crocodilians kind of spread throughout as you move through. So I thought that was great as well. And so when you arrived, was the collection about that size, or what role did you play as an individual in the collection, whether it's kind of the size or the composition? If you enjoy listening to the Snake Talk podcast, stay in the loop with the Orianne Society's latest conservation updates from the field. Read about new published research, as well as fascinating insights on the species we work with by following us on social media. Follow, like, share. Let's spread the word. Together, we can make a difference. Find the Orianne Society on Instagram, Facebook, X, or LinkedIn and be part of the conversation.
So when I kind of took over the collection planning, I really want to diversify our collection. It was very venomous snake heavy, which I do love, of course, but we need a little bit of everything for people to see. And so my goal was to get some different species, different amphibian species, different lizard species, and from all over the world. And I always kind of tried to get the stuff other places didn't have as well, just because I thought that would be neat for people to see things they've never heard of. But I also think it's important to have some things in your own backyard, like you said. We have speckled racers, indigo snakes, milk snakes, coral snakes, a lot of native species, including the black-spotted newt, which is
Texas tortoise. You had
going up for, Texas tortoise, yeah. And so it's important to have stuff in your backyard. But then we have things like Mengshan vipers from China.
Oh, that was the rarest. Yeah, that was probably one of the most impressive exhibits you guys had in the herpetarium. It was amazing. We stood there for at least 15 minutes. Anyway, sorry, I cut you off. Keep going. Mengshan vipers, which are probably the rarest snake in the whole world. And we have a breeding group of them. And we were fortunate enough to breed those a couple years ago. And we got some babies, and we were only the third zoo in the United States to do that. So it was a great accomplishment for the team, and so that's what I did, was just try to diversify the collection, and we still got a long way to go, but it's getting there. Great. Well, I would recommend anybody who goes to that part of the world for a field herping or to drink beer on a beach, make sure you go check out the zoo. The herpetarium's amazing. The collection there is amazing. And then even beyond that, just great cats, incredible collection of primates, just all around a good zoo. So, yeah. And so, if I would argue that all zoos play an important role in conservation, in that, the kind of the education and outreach mandate that zoos have kind of always been built around. But a lot of zoos are moving more into conservation of animals in the wild, oftentimes kind of doing the husbandry components that support those species, or actually having, people working in the field. Just curious your perspective on the zoo, and both, I guess, from that education outreach component and how you feel, how effective the zoo's been to local communities and beyond, and then, touching on anything, kind of more that other component of conservation, beginning to work with the animals to help conserve them in the wild, even if it's husbandry work.
Yeah, as far as like local outreach goes, our education department, I don't remember the numbers of kids they reach on a yearly basis, but it's a lot. It's like over 60,000 kids or something like that. And with that, they're bringing live animals to let them touch and hold or whatever, which I think is so important, instead of just looking at them through a display case. As good as that is, you'll never replace a child being able to touch a snake for the first time and seeing that they're not a scary animal. And a lot of times they'll be scared at first, but as soon as they touch them, it sets them at ease. And you never know, it sets them down a path that maybe they become a zookeeper one day. And so that sort of thing is really important to what we do. And then as far as some conservation projects we got going on, we're non-reptile right now. We're working on ocelot conservation. The ocelot, the endangered cat that also occurs here in South Texas. With our female cat that we have, they're trying artificial insemination to try to get babies from that female, because there's so few in captivity, that basically they're bringing, they're doing that from another cat from Cincinnati Zoo, and then hopefully we get some babies from that. And then we have a black-spotted newt breeding program. Like I said, black-spotted newts are a candidate species for federal listing, and they are in deep trouble down here. And my eventual goal is to try to breed them and have site releases of just hundreds of eggs or larvae, to try to boost their numbers down here in South Texas. And then finally, the big one for us is the Kemp's Ridley Sea Turtle Project down in Tamaulipas, Mexico. Our director, Patrick Birchfield, he's not going to take credit for this, but he pretty much saved that species from extinction. And now they are thriving down on the beaches, and they have egg monitoring and collection after the hatchling. They monitor them, or they take data and then do releases to make sure that they hatch and all this stuff. So it's incredible work they're doing down there, and it's directly overseen by our guys here in the States.
Yeah, that's great. Quite a legacy that you guys are leaving behind. On the newt, is the newt similar to a lot of the species there, being that it is at the northern edge of its range, only occurs in this part of the U.S., and then goes down into Mexico? Is that accurate?
Yep, pretty much, yeah. But they're not all that common in Mexico either. So they're in trouble across their whole range, but especially in South Texas with all the habitat destruction and pollution of the waterways, things like that, is really taking a toll on them. So, like I said, our goal is to breed as many as we can, and that's one component that zoos help with, right? They have the resources and to breed things in captivity, and then can work with wildlife officials to try to do releases. I know several zoos around the country do it for the striped newt there in Florida, and so we're hoping to kind of mimic that and do something like that here in South Texas.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I hope you guys continue on that and have success. So, well, Clint, we've been going about an hour, and I want to be very mindful of your time. But before we begin to wrap up, is there anything we missed on the zoo front that you wanted to cover, or field herping, or really any of it? Anything that you feel is important we left out?
I just want to echo what you said, that if people are down here looking for snakes or even birds or whatever they may be doing, just come to the zoo, support local zoos in general. They're after the pandemic, zoos took a big hit and they need that help and visitors to help boost numbers. And in turn, that money could be put towards things like conservation efforts and things like that.
Great. Well, why don't you imagine that I come down to Texas and maybe we cross the border and we go into Mexico and we go into some really interesting region and we spend the day out looking for things we've never seen and just have a great day, and we're sitting around a campfire at night, just talking about the day and anything that comes to mind, and then I turn to you and ask you to tell me your best snake story.
Oh man. Well, it's probably best snake story, but also my best flipping story, which they seem to go hand in hand. I was a friend of mine came down and visited, and he was able to go early in the day and flip a couple cat-eyed snakes. We didn't really talk much about them, but that's another really rare species that only occurs here. And so I was like, wow, I've never seen two in one stack before. And so right after work, I headed up there to go see if I could just see them and get a photo of them together, thinking that it was probably a pair. And so I get through this stack of 10, and at the very bottom is 7 cat-eyed snakes, all at the bottom, all together, bundled up. And it was just incredible. I couldn't believe that they were all under there together.
Just kind of together, like physically in a ball almost.
Not so much a ball, I guess, but they were all kind of just coiled up next to each other. About 4 of them were on one side and 3 of them on the other. But then it was just chaos because it was actually night by this time that I was flipping these. And so like I had a flashlight in my mouth, and then all of a sudden they all start moving. They all start bailing on me. I'm like, oh my gosh. And I'm like trying to hold up this 10 stack at the same time. So I was able to grab some, which was again, just to take some photos and then release. But I was only able, I think, to get 5. And at that, I was super stoked, of course. But then I put the stack back down. I took some photos of these animals. And then I was like, you know what, let me flip this again. And I flipped them, and the other 2 were back under there. So they came back. And so I was able to get all 7 in hand. And it just unreal. And so that was the most insane flipping I've had. If it was like 7 garter snakes or something more common, it wouldn't have been as neat. But this is a super rare species. Up until that point, like I said, I had only found 1 at a time. I've never even seen 2, let alone 7. So yeah. I think it was probably some breeding thing. I don't know if there was just a single female and a bunch of males. I'm not really sure, but I was pretty happy.
Yeah. I love moments like that when you're in them and you realize this might be the only time in my life that I ever see this. So that's great. Well, I will. I'll put the link to the zoo on in the show notes so everybody can get more information and figure out how to get there. And then, are there other places people can find you, social media or websites or anything like that? Or is the zoo is the zoo the best place? Facebook. Okay.
Yeah, the zoo, or just I got a Facebook, I have an Instagram, anything like that. Find me on any of those.
Great. Well, Clint, really appreciate you joining us and talking about this fascinating corner of the world. I hope to see you again down there someday, or really hope to have you out to Georgia and show you an eastern indigo snake. That'd be a lot of fun. So, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate it.
Great. And I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.